When John discovered his private well had been filled with concrete by his overzealous HOA, he didn't just get mad, he got even. Armed with legal savvy and a knack for bureaucracy, he turned the tables, freezing their water contract with the city and leaving the entire neighborhood scrambling. This is the story of one man's fight against petty tyranny and how he outsmarted a powerful HOA at their own game. John had lived in the quiet subdivision of Willow Creek for nearly a decade. It was a peaceful place, or so he thought, until the Homeowners Association, HOA, began tightening its grip. At first, it was small things, fines for untrimmed hedges, complaints about mailbox colors. But John, a retired civil engineer with a sharp mind and a low tolerance for nonsense, kept his head down. He paid his dues, followed the rules, and maintained his modest 2-acre lot, which included a private well he'd relied on for years. That well was his pride, a self-sufficient system he'd engineered himself, drawing clean water from deep below the earth. It saved him hundreds on utility bills and gave him a sense of independence. The trouble started in the spring of 2024. The HOA, led by Karen Whitaker, a self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, sent John a letter. It claimed his well was an unauthorized structure and violated the HOA's covenants. John was baffled. The well predated the HOA's formation, and he had all the permits, filed neatly in a folder from when he'd built it in 2012. He responded politely, attaching copies of the permits and a surveyor's report confirming the well was on his property. He assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived, this time demanding he decommission the well or face legal action. John called the HOA office, hoping to reason with someone. Karen answered, her voice dripping with condescension. She explained that the board had decided wells were unsightly and could lower property values. John pointed out that his wellhead was barely visible, tucked behind a small shed. Karen didn't budge. Rules are rules, she said, and hung up. John wasn't one to roll over. He hired a lawyer, Tom Reynolds, who specialized in property disputes. Tom reviewed the HOA's covenants and confirmed what John suspected. The well was grandfathered in, and the HOA had no legal authority to force its removal. Tom sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA, warning them to back off. For a moment, it seemed to work. The letters stopped, and John thought he'd won. Then came the morning of June 5, 2024. John woke to the sound of heavy machinery. He stepped outside to find a concrete truck parked on his driveway, its chute aimed at his wellhead. 2 workers, hired by the HOA, were pouring wet concrete into the well. John shouted for them to stop, but they shrugged, showing him a work order signed by Karen. By the time John called the police, the damage was done. The well, his lifeline, was filled with 20 cubic yards of concrete, rendering it useless. John was livid, but he stayed calm. He knew rage wouldn't help. The police took a report, but since it was a civil matter, they couldn't arrest anyone on the spot. Tom filed an emergency injunction to stop further interference and began preparing a lawsuit against the HOA for property damage and trespassing. The estimated cost to drill a new well was $15,000, not including legal fees. John wasn't wealthy, but he was resourceful. He started digging, not into the ground, but into the HOA's operations. John had a hunch the HOA wasn't as untouchable as they thought. Years of working on municipal projects had taught him how local governments functioned. He began researching Willow Creek's infrastructure, focusing on the water supply. The neighborhood relied on a contract with the city for water services, negotiated through the HOA to secure bulk rates. John suspected the contract might be a weak point. He spent hours at City Hall, combing through public records with the help of a sympathetic clerk named Maria. What John found was gold. The HOA's water contract, signed in 2018, was set to expire in July 2025. The city had a clause allowing residents to petition for a review of the contract if they could prove mismanagement by the HOA. John realized this was his leverage. If he could delay or freeze the contract renewal, the HOA would lose its ability to negotiate rates, forcing residents to pay higher individual utility bills. It wouldn't bankrupt anyone, but it would make the HOA wildly unpopular. John's first step was to gather evidence of the HOA's overreach. He collected his own case, letters, permits, and photos of the concrete-filled well. But he needed more. He started talking to neighbors, discreetly at first. Many were frustrated with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. There was Mike, fined $500 for parking his RV in his own driveway. Sarah, a single mom, had been threatened with foreclosure over late dues during a medical emergency. Slowly, John built a network of allies, meeting in his living room to share stories and documents. By August 2024, John had a dossier of complaints. 15 residents with evidence of unfair fines, harassment, or property interference. He and Tom drafted a formal petition to the city, requesting a suspension of the water contract pending an investigation into the HOA's conduct. The petition needed 50 signatures from Willow Creek residents to trigger a review. John went door to door, explaining the plan without mentioning his well. He focused on the HOA's pattern of abuse. Most neighbors signed eagerly, fed up with Karen's reign. On September 10th, John submitted the petition to the city council. The HOA caught wind of it and panicked. Karen called an emergency board meeting, where she accused John of sabotaging the community. She sent a newsletter claiming the petition would destroy property values and raise water bills. Some residents wavered, but John held firm. He attended the council meeting on October 3rd, presenting his case with calm precision. He laid out the HOA's violations, including his ruined well, and handed over the dossier. The council, impressed by the evidence, voted to freeze the water contract until an audit of the HOA's finances and practices could be completed. The audit was a nightmare for the HOA. It revealed sloppy bookkeeping, questionable vendor contracts, and a pattern of selective enforcement. Karen's brother-in-law, it turned out, owned the landscaping company that received most of the HOA's maintenance budget. The findings were damning enough for the city to extend the contract freeze indefinitely. Without the contract, water bills spiked by 30% for Willow Creek residents. The HOA's approval rating plummeted. Karen tried to rally support, blaming John for the mess. She organized a protest outside his house, but only a dozen people showed up, and half left when John offered them coffee and explained his side. The lawsuit against the HOA moved forward, with Tom securing a court order for the HOA to pay $20,000 to replace John's well. The board, facing mounting legal costs, ousted Karen in December 2024. A new president, a retired teacher named Linda, reached out to John to negotiate a settlement. John wasn't vindictive, but he wasn't done. He agreed to drop the lawsuit if the HOA covered his well replacement and repealed its anti-well rule. Linda, desperate to restore peace, agreed. By March 2025, John had a new well, deeper and better than the last. The HOA, humbled, adopted transparent bylaws and held open elections. The water contract remained frozen, a reminder of the cost of overreach. John's victory wasn't just personal. It reshaped Willow Creek. Neighbors started speaking up at meetings, holding the HOA accountable. John, ever the engineer, stayed out of the spotlight, content to tinker with his well and share his water with anyone who asked. He'd outsmarted a bully, not with fists, but with facts and patience. And in a small way, he'd reminded everyone that power, when unchecked, could be brought to its knees by one determined man.